Please make yourself comfortable as I discuss the world's oldest continuous civilization and its navigation of the complex relationship between tradition and modernity. In this analysis, I will explore how China has utilized invented traditions as a coping mechanism to deal with the psychological and cultural difficulties of modernization. What I find is that difficulties China has faced in their complicated process of modernization are relatively unique to China, and as has been the ways in which Chinese culture has addressed these difficulties. Let's first begin by unpacking some linguistic baggage and shedding some of the connotations to establish what the terms I use mean. In order to define tradition, we turn to page 32 of Simon Bronner's Explaining Traditions, in which Bronner explains that tradition, for our purposes, refers to customs, beliefs, doctrines, and behaviors which have been handed down from generation to generation. Do this, say this, believe that, act this way. This is what a man is and what our culture is, and this is how one is supposed to act. It's important to clarify that the very nature of tradition is antithetical to the notion of choice, and for centuries one never had the option to opt in or out of tradition. It simply was what it was. On the other hand, when defining modernity, it's important to expand our understanding beyond a European perspective or a Western perspective to something more helpful, specifically something more context dependent. In an effort to do so, Dari and Oyana explore the underlying universal characteristics of modernity, which ties the complex of modernity to its nexus, power. Specifically, modernity is power over three things. Power over people, through governments or organizations, or even specific individuals. Practical power over nature, specifically in terms of economic development and production. And intellectual power over nature, which manifests as a capacity for prediction. Whether that's meteorology or ecology, the ability to predict what otherwise was unpredictable. And while different cultures have different relationships with this power complex, the confluence of these three factors is how we describe a modern civilization. However, it is important to note that exposure to an unfiltered and undiluted form of this complex can be psychologically, culturally, and economically turbulent at best, and disastrous at worst. And now that we have covered those, we can discuss two very important variations of these ideas, invented traditions and compressed modernity. Hobsbawm and Ranger explain that invented traditions are beliefs, behaviors, and doctrines that have been created or invented to fit within a specific historical narrative in order to develop a sense of continuity with that narrative, a sense of continuity with that history. And there are two important things to bear in mind about these invented traditions. They vary in their enforcement and thus exist to some degree on an opt-in basis. And secondly, they're often created as a coping mechanism for the aforementioned turbulence of undiluted modernity, especially modernity of the compressed variety, which we discuss next. Kung-Sup Cheng explores this idea and explains that compressed modernity is a phenomenon in which modernization is experienced very rapidly, often over the course of a century or less. In China's case, this has occurred over 4 distinct stages, the most rapid of which having occurred over the last 50 years. To understand what I mean, let's look at two cases. The United States and China. Europe's Enlightenment began in roughly 1715, and the United States ratified its constitution based on those very Enlightenment ideals some 75 years later, then experiencing its Industrial Revolution nearly a century after that. Contrast what was at the time considered a short modernizing period relative to its European counterparts who had had thousands of years to do this, to China, who's seen much of the modernization with which we're concerned since Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which began in the late 1970s and persist to this day. For comparison, that's roughly 2 centuries to a period of about 50 years, and it's this drastic difference in time scale to which I'm referring when I discuss compressed modernity, as it packs all of the distress and anxieties of modernization into merely a generation or two. And with those clearly defined, now we're able to discuss some of the specific issues that China has faced in its process of modernizing. Firstly, China finds itself in quite the predicament, as the last several decades have prioritized economic development over political or social development. This has created a situation in which social problems, such as dishonesty and indifference, have risen in prominence, even ingraining themselves in the culture, essentially inventing themselves as traditions. And this is directly related to the rise of individualism that Chang discusses, in which the state and its state-led economic development is directly responsible for this. Contrast this with traditional Chinese understandings, specifically Confucian ties to harmony and the prioritization of people over materials, specifically over material gain, and then tying that to China's Marxist past, we find a rather delicate balance which the state and the culture is attempting to strike. Additionally, this drive towards economic development has left many Chinese people rather neglected, as disparities between Eastern and Western, urban and rural China have steadily grown. This has resulted in a social conception that ties one's merit, one's cultural and social value to the opportunities which they've been afforded, primarily due to factors well beyond their control, such as geography and their ability to move to an urban environment with more opportunities. As Wenlong and Holbrook explain, this has resulted in terms like peasant and peasant worker carrying much stronger negative connotations than they have before, specifically in the eyes of urban residents who have seen the greatest benefits of their hard work. This is because the work of rapid industrialization that we've seen in China has fallen squarely on the shoulders of migrant peasant workers who moved east out of their rural homelands to develop their country. Essentially, this act was an act of unity, an act of harmony with one society on behalf of these migrant workers. However, this treatment that they have received flies squarely in the face of that tradition of Chinese culture, that Confucian tradition of harmony and unity between people. Yet despite this, we've observed that China's recent development has neglected this harmony, opting instead for almost a more Western cultural approach, which sees harmonious development, which prioritizes harmony between man and society, man and his peers, and man and his inner self, as antithetical to the goals of economic development, which prioritizes productive growth and expansion. Thus, in order to compete in a rapidly globalizing system, the traditional notion of harmonious development seems to have been neglected and has given way to a new tradition, an invented tradition, that of unrivaled economic development. And while, sure, this has certainly brought some benefits for the state and for its population, this has also resulted in a tumultuous relationship between these newer cultures which have worked their way into Chinese society and the traditional cultures which have been left behind in favor of them. What we can see is that this has brought an additional side effect, and that is the negligence of nature. In Confucian tradition, a great emphasis is placed on the harmony between society and nature, and man and nature. However, this specific relationship has been all but abandoned in China's quest for modernity. As pollution and ecological destruction skyrocket within the productive powerhouse, what we've seen is a cultural and, by extension, a traditional shift from this harmony and this harmonious development to a sense of a new tradition of economic domination, which appears to have won out. Altogether, what this analysis has come to observe is a shift in Chinese culture and a shift in the traditions by which it abides. This shift has been one from harmony within itself, with others, and with the world at large, to a new invented tradition of victory and domination over others, over oneself, and over the world at large. And this specifically is how the Chinese people and Chinese culture have adapted and changed to cope with the conflicts of modernization. Because one of the strongest and most powerful feelings associated with the experiencing of undiluted modernity is one of powerlessness. And so it makes sense that what we've observed is, quite frankly, a visceral response and a swing in the opposite direction, one of asserting power and assuming control. That is, in my estimation, how the Chinese people have coped with their very complex experience.